I've been in this space since 2001, and it's pretty amazing just how quickly things are moving in this new direction. So we're going to dive in and talk about the world of testing. It's going to be primarily the SAT and the ACT, though with some discussion of some new entities coming in, PARCC and Smarter Balance, which we'll discuss later in the webinar. I'll give 3 quick slides here in terms of just the foundational constructs of the 2 assessments, because they were initially designed to create as very different measures. The SAT was designed in the 1920s to measure aptitude, and it was built from an IQ test, and the ACT was built from achievement tests from the Iowa tests. It's called the American College Test. So just really quickly, again, Carl Brigham, he worked on the Army Alpha tests, which were IQ tests in the First World War. He adapted them to make a Harvard test to try to find really smart kids in the Midwest primarily, and then this became the SAT. And it was intentionally divorced from the high school curriculum because the idea was kids who hadn't gone to Groton or Exeter or Andover, but just were very smart, bright kids who might do well at Harvard. So it was a modified IQ test with all kind of, it was like numerical, like seeing patterns and advanced vocabulary, and it was almost like a Wechsler today. Then the gentleman in Iowa, his name was Everett Lindquist. He was a researcher in the 1920s. He was working on the Iowa tests. And in the late 1950s, he was fed up, actually, with what was happening with the College Board, didn't like this movement towards aptitude, and thought it was the wrong approach. So he countered with the ACT, and he was out in Iowa City. So that was his idea, and his thing was, let's measure achievement. We can trust achievement, measure achievement, but what aptitude, what is that, the general factor for intelligence, and is that the right thing to measure? He said, no, let's measure achievement. And now the U.S. is vindicating Mr. Lindquist because achievement has become the dominant force and the dominant idea in assessment, whereas aptitude is really fading in terms of admissions. So let's look closely at this, and it's pretty compelling, the reason we're having all these changes. The ACT is just on a tear, and whereas the College Board, they're flat, their growth curve, you can see they actually had a decline in 2013. And were it not for their school day initiative, where they're doing school day testing like on a Wednesday in a school, they say it's for low-income kids, but really it's to pad their numbers. Because were it not for school day, that would be a straight down line. So the College Board is really they're flagging, they're falling apart, and the ACT is taking off, and that curve will keep getting steeper and steeper because they added just 5 new states with these statewide contracts for next year. So it's pretty amazing watching this meteoric rise of the ACT, and we'll talk about why that is. It's a few, just the changes as the SAT. It's really it's falling off in Michigan. These are major decreases. Illinois, Ohio, as the ACT is gaining in states that were traditionally College Board states. California, it's doubling. Oregon, it's almost tripling. Washington, Hawaii. Things are really moving very quickly all over the map. Now, the ultimate question is what's going on here? Why is this happening? The reps from the ACT, kudos to them in terms of their strategy, and they've been aggressive, and they've been phenomenal at positioning this assessment as a dual-purpose test. They've been pitching it as this is great because it'll help your kids get into college. It's meaningful for admissions and scholarships. But more than that, it'll help you measure how well your teachers are doing, how well your schools are performing. You can compare this school to that school based on the metric of test score on the ACT. And there are many states who are using this for that purpose, even measuring the performance principles on the outcomes of their testing and their scores in the ACT. Additionally, the ACT is, by its very nature, much more aligned with the curriculum. Therefore, it is much more aligned with the Common Core. The Common Core is the agreed-upon standards we've all said you have to master for math and sciences, reading, and so forth to be ready for college and the workforce. And the ACT was always better there by its very design. The statewide contracts have been profoundly important for this rise also, because they don't go and it's not student by student. They lock down a whole state, and that's been pretty incredible how they've been getting states to use their budget for these assessments from 2001 to now, and they're just on a tear. So looking at that, this was back last year looking at the statewide contracts. A lot of them had Explore and Plan tests, which were the preliminary tests for the ACT. Explore was 8th grade, Plan was 9th and 10th grade. They've now filled this map in more thoroughly, but some of those things are I want to focus primarily not on the work keys or compass, but really on the SAT, ACT component. So the College Board, in contrast, they've been pretty paltry. They had Idaho, they had Maine, and they had Delaware. That was their 3 state contracts. But they've been unable to convert at the state level. They recently, it was in the news, they picked up Michigan. That was their first big win in, honestly, over a decade, several decades. But that was not because of the preference for the SAT or this new SAT. That was honestly an error in the bidding process. There was an RFP out to different testing organizations, the ACT, the SAT. The ACT, they priced it with an essay. So obviously their average cost per student was higher, whether it was $10, $15 higher. The SAT, the College Board, priced their new assessment, the new SAT, without the graded essay. Therefore, they came in markedly under, and they won the bid that way. So it wasn't on the merits of the new SAT, it was on the merits of a lower price and some confusion with how to respond to the RFP. The proposal was just underpriced. Then ACT, which is so unusual, they protested. And they said, wait a minute, we could have priced ours lower had we also excluded the essay, but it was already too late. So Michigan just picked up, by accident, the SAT contract, where it's been a state for the ACT for almost a decade. That was pretty interesting. So here is just a list of what's going on, of why this is taking place. Illinois and Colorado were first. Chicago kids, they had the Prairie test in April, which is the ACT plus a career assessment. Kentucky, Michigan, Wyoming hopped on board in 2007. Dakotas, Tennessee, 2 years ago is Carolina, and now look at this: Hawaii, Louisiana, Montana, Alabama, Utah, and this year Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Nevada, and Wisconsin. So we're seeing this tremendous growth. That's 18, 19 states who are giving every student an ACT. It's unbelievable. There is a shift, though. When I was up in Chicago and I heard about this change, Illinois is, now the Common Core is here. And the Common Core, it's actually, an opportunity, but also a threat, because every school, every district, every state, they have limited funding for assessments. How much they purchase. And right now, there's an overabundance, actually, of assessments. And so the folks in Illinois decided, you know what? Let's move some of our funding, our money, from the ACT over to the PARCC assessments, which is a Common Core assessment, and let schools decide if they want to use the ACT. So Illinois really is not going to be a statewide contract going forward, but they might reconsider this. But now it just comes down to budget. And do they have budget for the Common Core tests, or do they have budget for the ACT? And the ACT is trying to place itself in lieu of the Common Core assessments and say, use us instead. And that honestly is part of the great narrative here. It's the battle for Common Core, and the battle to be not just the Common Core test for college admissions, but the Common Core test for grades 3 through 12. So that's the larger context of this little game on top with the seniors and juniors. One thing that's also accountable for the rise of the ACT is the use of the Explore and the Plan test. Those were the precursor tests. Explore was 8th grade, Plan was in 9th and 10th. And what schools were doing, the ACT reps pitched to states, hey, why don't you use our Explore and our Plan test for your 8th graders, your 9th graders, 10th graders, even if you're, you use the PSAT for the National Merit Test, why don't you go ahead and give our kids this option? So getting in early in 8th grade was the beginning of flipping the cultures of schools, districts, and states. So they kind of got in the door with the toe with the Explore test, but eventually they added on the ACT. So that was a strategy which has paid off in spades over the past decade. But then I think the ACT may have overplayed its hand. So they had all of these states, Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, Michigan, Utah, Carolinas, all using the Explore or the Plan or both of those assessments. And then often they were migrating to the ACT in full. But the ACT Inc. said, you know what? We're not content with owning grades 8, 9, 10, 11. We want to own the whole thing, the whole enchilada. So we're going to move to this thing called the Aspire. And the Aspire test is currently it's grades 3 through 10, and then you have the ACT in grade 11, 12. This test, one of the fundamental changes is it's a digital test. It's fundamentally digital. And if you want a paper-based test, you have to pay twice as much as a way to discourage that behavior. However, a lot of schools do not have the infrastructure to give every single student a laptop or a computer console or a tablet. So only 2 states, Alabama and South Carolina, have done a statewide contract for the Aspire. And there have been complaints about the implementation, about the rollout. And this, they're looking over at their neighbors at PARCC and Smarter Balanced. Those are 2 testing consortia that are going to be making the Common Core assessments, which are also digital. And also the ACT is going to be offered in digital form this year, as will the SAT next year. So things are moving digital, as did the GRE and the GMAT and the LSAT. Digital is where it's at. And we know digital testing is the future of assessment. So, however, you can see they went from having, a good over a dozen states using their Explore and Plan. Now they have 2. And so that may have been a real mistake, a real misstep. They could have been too aggressive. And I think their pricing is such that they're really, discouraging the paper. But that's where a lot of states are. There's still a digital divide in terms of who has the funding and the money, and certain districts and states aren't as funded. So this, I think, may have been a misstep on the part of the folks at the ACT, even though it's part of their long-term strategy to migrate everybody towards digital assessment. And also the Aspire, it's not just once a year. There's a formative test at the beginning, a summative test at the end, and intermediary tests at intervals throughout the year. So it really is a real revenue play. They're making $10 per kid for the Plan or Explore, but with the Aspire, they could make $30 a kid plus. But that really, it seems like it's backfired for them. That's kind of an interesting thing. All right. The Common Core State Standards Initiative is really a big deal. Currently 45 states still are going to adhere to the Common Core, but it's being battled now. Now it's become a GOP fighting point. It's so funny because this was a statewide thing. It wasn't federal government. It was governors all over the country, many Republican governors who are way behind this, including like Jeb Bush. But now the GOP has decided, oh wait, this smells like big government, even though it was a state-run thing. And so now they're starting to attack it politically, even though I think there are serious merits of this educationally, philosophically. And there has been some issues in terms of the rollout, which I think we all knew there was going to be. This wasn't going to be a seamless transition. But this is in response to the No Child Left Behind. That movement was really about just testing and teaching to a test, and I think it gutted critical thinking in our schools in many regards. It was simply mastery of multiple choice assessments, whereas the Common Core, there's no question this thing gets back to critical thinking skills in a major way. That's the point of it. The kind of skills you're going to need for the workforce, and it's also a profound change in how we assess math fluency and math readiness, how we assess reading fluency, writing fluency. And it's a much more robust set of standards. I've spoken with teachers all over the country, and they say, you know what, this is a great thing, but ultimately it's right now it's hard, or this is so different that the kids who are being thrown into it right now are kind of lost, as are the teachers, whereas potentially the students who are being exposed to this Common Core pedagogy in grade 1, 2, 3, 4 now will be champs in 5, 6 years. But it seems disorienting both for students and some teachers and for parents. I've heard parents complain, I can't teach my kid 3rd grade math because it's a different math than we were given. But it's the kind of math that will get kids to think differently about math. And I'll be demonstrating later on some of the new question types and showing off what that looks like in this new world of assessment. So the Common Core State Standards Initiative that was done by educators and states, there were 47, 48, now there are 45, but it's been under attack in 12 states. The testing consortia, PARCC and Smarter Balance, these were funded by the Department of Education and assigned with making the new Common Core aligned assessments. So, and those were going to be, giving kids tests, trying to figure out, are these kids ready for college, and are they ready for the workforce in terms of these 21st century thinking skills. But part of it is if you have a 12th grade Common Core test by PARCC or Smarter Balanced, which is measuring mastery of Common Core concepts and also trying to predict college readiness, well, isn't that the mission of the SAT and the ACT? So it puts them at odds. It puts PARCC and Smarter Balanced in competition with the College Board and the ACT Inc. At a serious level, which is leading to the College Board and the ACT having to change their game because they might be knocked out by these new entrants, and that's part of these massive changes. So the Common Core, it's still big. Only 5 states, are not adopting it. There's been some attrition. Was that Gary? Do you want to hop in?
Yes, if I could.
Yeah, please.
The answer to question number one for the CCA continuing education is ACT. Again, that's ACT. Thank you, Jed.
Sure thing. So 12 states, if you look at their media blitzes, it could be political candidates or parties saying we're going after the Common Core, my child is not common, all that nonsense, that's taking place. Indiana pulled it in 14, South Carolina repealed it. And I have a slide here to demonstrate what that really is about. In South Carolina, it's quite interesting. They said, you know what, we're going to pull Common Core, and we're not going to use Smarter Balanced. They had a testing contract with them, we're going to withdraw it. Part of this, and the same thing would happen in Georgia, they decided that, if we use the Smarter Balanced assessment, it may reveal, profound deficits our kids have. Same thing in Georgia. Georgia often fares very, very poorly when compared to other states in terms of how their kids are doing, how their kids are ready. And this is going to be a unified metric. It'll really expose the deficits, and that's part of what the Common Core is about. The Common Core is supposed to raise the bar, but by doing so, it's going to reveal what's lacking, what's missing. Wow, these kids really aren't prepared. And many states and many teachers, they don't like that. It's going to make them look bad. And so Georgia just came out and said, you know what, we're going to keep the Common Core, but we're going to develop our own assessments, which is pretty nuts. I mean, you think about the efficiencies you're going to lose having every state make their own tests. And part of this was to have some uniformity, some sense of, are kids getting a 3.3 in a certain state who go into college and can't read or write? That's a problem. We really can't trust grades always to measure ability and ready for college and the workforce. Having a uniform standard is, I think advantageous and desirable, and it's part of the idea behind the Common Core. So states trying to go at their own might really muddy the waters or really change the picture and maybe cloak some of the reality. But what happened here is, so when South Carolina said, you know what, we're bailing on the Common Core, we're going to bail on Smarter Balanced, they said they opened it up for bidding of who's going to win this contract. And they opened it up, and who won the contract? Surprise, it was the ACT. With their Aspire product, they said, ACT Inc., right now go ahead and you can assess our kids grade 3 through 8, and build a new set of standards that we'll agree to. So that is the big play here. It's about the ACT and the College Board looking and saying, this world of testing is so much bigger than grades 11 and 12. There's, and the money goes all the way down to kindergarten essentially. And if we aren't careful, Parker and Smarter Balance will come and carve out that territory and then maybe knock us off in grade 11 and 12. So their thing is, their attack strategy is go younger and lock them in earlier. And that's really interesting. So the College Board is watching all this happening, and they had no choice. If they didn't change, they're going to go away. They're going to become obsolete as they see their numbers plummeting. And they have been shifting their piece from aptitude to achievement since the beginning. In 1918, when they began working on the Army Alpha, was an IQ test, pure and simple. And then in 26, this first assessment was essentially a modified IQ test that was harder for these college kids. But they've been shifting it actually all the way through, in the 30s and the 60s and 70s. But the most recent changes I want to highlight have been in the past 20-some years, where they've been moving away from aptitude, moving away from abstract thinking, abstract IQ kind of questions, towards achievement. In 94, they killed antonyms, and that's, vocabulary is simply a measure of crystallized intelligence. How many words you know, that's, on any Wechsler or Stanford Binet, it's, IQ is wrapped up, there's always a vocab measure. So they got rid of antonyms, and they added some student response and some more advanced mathematics. In 2005, that was a major move away from aptitude. They killed the analogies, which again, analogies is purely IQ abstract thinking. And they also killed these things, these quantitative comparisons, where you didn't have to know how to solve the answer, but just to know, can you tell which one's bigger? Do you have enough information? And that was more of an abstract thinking kind of concept. They also added the most popular SAT subject test, the writing test, and that had been around for 30 years. And there was research in 2001 that the SAT subjects are more predictive of performance in college than the SAT reasoning tests. So they wholesale added the writing test in 2005, and that was a big change. So that was a major move towards achievement. Now this new one, and 16, they are abandoning aptitude as as a construct. This test is no longer tied to that in any way. They drop the sentence completions, which was the final stay of vocabulary. The first test was almost half vocabulary. It was, there were like 300 items. There were so many antonyms. This new test is getting rid of that. We're moving away from that. Harder vocabulary will still be in this assessment, but it's going to be primarily in the passages, not so much in these completions or antonyms or analogies. The math is getting harder across the board. They're putting grammar and context. They're adding science, and an essay that is really a critical thinking, evidence-based essay. And I'm going to go through all those changes on the next few slides. So again, this is a big shift, but finally it ends with achievement being the end-all be-all, which is very similar to the ACT. So the big overhaul of the test, let me walk through some of the big things coming. One of the small changes, like the ACT, they're now going to get rid of their guessing penalty. They're simply going to add up the number correct. That'll just be easier for kids who are struggling with do I guess or leave it blank and having to worry about that strategy. Science is coming. So Common Core standards, they measure science fluency, science readiness. So you know what? They're adding it. They're not wholesale adding a new science section, but they're embedding the science, they're trickling it among the verbal and the math section. And also a big change, they're making just 2 sections. Now there's going to be verbal and a quant section. They haven't named them yet, versus having a math, critical reading, writing. Now critical reading and writing are being merged, and math and science are being merged. And there'll be some smattering of science in the reading as well. So you're going to have graphs, charts, and tables just like the ACT. That's a big change there. Grammar, when I first saw the grammar, when they released the problem set back last April, I was amazed. This looks just like the ACT. Because part of it, the Common Core standards are, can you find these errors, can you misplace modifiers, commas, usage in the context of writing? The College Board initially presented their information in the abstract. They would have an error ID. Here's a single sentence. Find the mistake. There was no context. Here's a sentence. Improve this single sentence. No context. But the Common Core, they want you to be able to articulate these issues in the context of reading, which the ACT has done since the late 50s. So they are essentially ripping off wholesale the ACT in this regard. That there's no overlap at all. I mean, there's no difference whatsoever. The most fundamental change, the thing that struck me in the head when I saw the most recent problem set, it was like, I was kicked and I was kind of reeling, was the math section. And you often hear this when parents are complaining about Common Core math. They don't know what to make of it. It's so different. It's such a departure from what we're used to, and from what I'm used to. I've been teaching these tests since 2001, and I've gotten to be decent. I'm more of a verbal person than a math person, but I've been able to find tricks and techniques and strategies to compensate, and I found a way to do quite well on the math section. But this new test is so different. And just as an example, I'll show you some problems later on, but on the calculator-free math section, on the 18 items, I missed 9 of them. And where I'm used to getting in the 700s to 800 on math, I'm clearly not there on this new test. So the ability, success on the old SAT will not necessarily predict that on the new one. It's really a different kind of test, especially math. So what they did, they were looking at the Common Core standards as they built this math test. They were not looking at the old SAT or even the ACT. They're looking at what are the standards, let's build it from there. This new test is less about speed and less about little rules and tricks and heuristics. This new test is gutting geometry. Geometry was 4 in 10 questions. Now it's going on to 1 in 10 questions. This new test really is about algebra. And you know what? That actually makes sense. Because if you look closely at the math that students are doing in college, no one's doing geometry in college. I mean, very few, you have engineers, but the majority of kids are onto more abstract kind of math concepts. They're onto calculus. They're onto, which is again less physical, geometric, more abstract, and algebra is in that direction. So this actually makes some sense, putting less of a focus on geometry for a college admissions test. I actually agree with that. And they're also adding all of the content that's currently on the ACT and more. They're going deeper and harder. Trigonometry, circle, they're adding all these new concepts that are much more difficult than kids have seen before. It's more like the Math 2 exam, essentially. On the calculator-free section, this is about fluency and theory, not about can I solve, but can I see a question and understand what's happening, which is really more of what the Common Core wants. The Common Core wants fluency. The Common Core wants applied math, and and conceptual understanding, not just can I solve this problem and not know what it means. So that's a profound change in the test. I'll show you again some of those problems. So again, Math 2 had trigonometry, functions, solid geometry, spheres and cones. Math 2, the SAT subject test, has logarithms, inverse functions, ellipses, hyperbolas, more trig, sines and cosines, and the new SAT is integrating items from all of these. So, and this is actually going to surpass the ACT in terms of difficulty level. The new problems are really showing off, whereas the old problems were that you're plugging a number in. Is it 17? Is it 30? You have to give an equation. The new questions, which I'll have some examples of later, are really asking you to describe the scenario and understand, what does X stand for here? What does Y stand for? What is, what do these integers mean? Not can I solve an equation? It's very different. A very remarkable difference is timing. David Coleman back in 2012 and NACAC in Toronto came out and said, you know what? We're looking at backing off of processing speed. We think we've been putting too much focus on speed, and we're going to make a move in that direction. So already you can see the items for, then the ACT, 36 seconds per question for grammar. You have an additional 7 seconds on the current SAT, but now you're going to have an additional nearly 12 seconds. That's about a third more time for very similar content. That's meaningful. On the reading, look at that difference. Currently, you have about 10 seconds more, but now you're going to have 22 seconds more. Again, that's like 35% more time. That's meaningful. Same with math. The math items right now, you're going to have 24 seconds additional per item for math. So the new items, granted, are harder, but they're not that much harder. So some of this extra time is going to help kids who are slower on the assessments, and that's going to be, for those kids who cannot get extended time or accommodations, who are a little bit slower at processing speed, they may do better on the new SAT, even with this difficulty level, because pacing is so important on the ACT. It's really a speed test par excellence. Now, reading is going to look like the ACT, where they're adding additional context, different kinds of passages they're going to add, literature, more advanced literature. They're going to add science reading, like the ACT, more humanities. They're also going to add in charts, tables, graphs, and such, which is already on the ACT, into this new SAT. The one thing that we saw when we reviewed and analyzed the December problem set was the degree of difficulty of the passages. That was much more like the SAT literature test or the AP English test than it was like the old SAT. They're really raising the bar in terms of difficulty and context, the complexity of texts. That's quite dramatic. I'll show you a couple examples of that as well. Now the essay, I think everyone agrees that this new essay is a remarkable improvement. The old essay on the SAT, it was always the first section, was, I believe, the weakest link of that test. The essay was essentially an opinion piece where they give you a prompt such as, does creativity come from planning or from spontaneity, and just what's the source of true creativity? And then the students would opine, and they'd give examples. They can make up facts and dates and just improv. But it really wasn't analysis. It really wasn't. They had to. The more you write, the more advanced sentence structures you use, the more you reinforce your thesis, you get points for that. But it really wasn't deep critical thinking. Now, this new essay is strictly critical thinking. This new essay is going to have three components. One of them is how well did you read, and it's going to be like a document-based question where they're going to give you a passage and ask you to analyze that passage and write to describe how the author made his or her point, how the author used rhetorical devices, how the author used evidence to craft an argument, which is totally different than make up facts for me. And the 3 out of 12 points, you get 4 points for how well did you read that component, 4 points for your analysis, and then 4 points for your writing. So it's dropping from 12 points for your writing to just 4 points. This is really critical thinking. So the essay is going to be much longer. It's going to go from 25 minutes to 45 minutes, but it is a much more robust measure of how a student can analyze and write for college-level classes. So I think this is a great improvement. It's also going at the end of the essay, SAT. it's going to be, quote, optional, but not really optional. Colleges are going to want to see it. So what's happening, so the total timing of the SAT is not going to change. It's going to be a 3-hour assessment with an optional 45-minute essay, which together equals the 3 hours and 45 of today's SAT. So even though, so they're not changing the timing, but they're giving more time for the essay, and that's one of the reasons, and they're also giving more time per item. So that's a profound difference there. Okay. Now, another piece they did, which is controversial, is they threw in this content, calling it the Great Global Conversation, or the American Founding Documents. And they're throwing in some Americana. They're going to throw in stuff from either like the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, or some important world document, which actually may really, impact international kids, because a lot of kids, they don't know the U.S. Federalist Papers or Constitution, and that might put international kids at a disadvantage. And that's something that we saw. There is one passage on the sample set they gave out in December, where it was talking about the impeachment of Nixon and the Federalist Papers and a bicameral legislature and the rules of articles of impeachment, which kids from Singapore or Taiwan or Mexico have no idea about those things. So it presupposes a certain familiarity with that information. Now, globally, this new SAT, it appears to be the hardest SAT we've ever seen. And that's just simply what they're showing us. They gave us a problem set in December, late December, which blew my mind. I didn't know, and part of it, it wasn't a full test, but the problem set they gave was so much more difficult than anything we've seen. It makes me think, well, clearly this test is moving to a harder place, but until I see a calibrated, standardized test from the College Board, which no one has seen, and they punted on the release date until May. They promised it initially in December, then they promised it in March, and now they're delaying it until May, which they're obviously struggling with their deadlines. Hopefully they won't punt it anymore down the road. They already added a year delay from 15 to 16, but they're struggling with this piece. But I think that this level of difficulty is going to encourage many kids to migrate away from the SAT towards the ACT. But they've made clearly a harder test, and in the long game, I think they win if colleges come to view it as a harder test, and if colleges come to prefer it to the ACT. So far, no one's done that, and my sense is they're not going to make a move in that direction until there's data. And the class of 17, we're not going to see data until 2018, once those kids finish freshman year in college. So for a few years, I think the College Board knows it's going to be losing students, but they're really making a long play here. We're going to make a better Common Core test and a harder test, and hopefully we'll use this. And also, they're going to try to make a play for a grade 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 assessment as well, which is coming soon down the pipe. Okay. Gary.
Yes, answer to question number 2 is Common Core. Again, answer to question number 2 is Common Core. Thank you, Jed.
Sure thing. So here, I'm giving you, and I'll send this out with these links for you to actually go and peruse the questions. But meanwhile, just for this presentation, I'm going to show you a few on slides, so I'm not going back and forth between the website and this thing. But here is just to illustrate to you clearly some of the changes. So on math, when I talk about, it's a harder math test, what's that look like? And I hope you can read this. So here is the beginning of some science components. And I'm giving you, this graph with some scatter plots. And the question, look at the question. On the bottom left, which of the following is the best interpretation of the slope of the line of best fit in the problem's context? We've never seen that anywhere. That kind of question really is applied, but it's never showed up before on the SAT or the ACT. And you can see, like the answer choices, the predicted first metacarpal bone increase in centimeters for every centimeter increase in height, and so it's really showing you how to read the graph, but also how to interpret. And so on this section, you can use a calculator, but how's it going to help you? This is really you looking and understanding theoretically how and procedurally how to read this kind of graph. Another one, a researcher, and this is with the calculator section, is there an association between exercise and sleep? She has a survey with a random sample and found evidence of an association, which conclusion is well supported by the data. and so understanding positive associations. So it's again, your calculator, plugging things in, you can't do it here. This is not what they're asking. It's more word-based and conceptual. Same thing here, where they don't ask you to solve for x, they ask you to give the actual equations. The toll rates are this and this for a truck. Solving the system equations, what's the number of cars? And so you have to really figure out which of these two, would help you solve. Not, I'm going to plug in A, B, C, D, E. This is really, let me show what do I know. Again, a few more of the same. The scientist dives down, and the pressure increases linearly at this depth, this pound per square inch. What linear model best describes the pressure? So again, you have to give the model. You can't solve anything. And then finally, there's a couple more. These are, look how many words. You never see this before. They're really moving towards deeper word problems like you see on the ACT. And this one actually happens to be a very, very challenging problem. In terms of conversion rates, in terms of rupees, again, it's very applied. And this prepaid card, and I'm not going to have you solve this, but this is a multi-minute problem that they're asking. So we've never seen this before ever on the SAT. A few more examples. This is on the calc-free section, the heart of algebra. And again, look, it's so much of this is algebra. The mean students can be used to the equation. They give you y equals point, then x represents this. What is the best interpretation of that constant? So you have to be able to interpret what does 0.8636 mean. They've never asked that ever on any SAT in history. The same thing here. 1 over x plus 2 over x is 1/5 is a printing job, and they give you how the printers work. What does 1 over x represent? So again, this is a different kind of test, and many kids are not ready for this. Honestly, I found myself struggling with these kind of questions. So that's going to give you a sense, and you can go back on that link and go through all these questions, but realize this is a tougher test. There's no question. And the reading. So here they pulled from Edith Wharton's book, and the language. I was so surprised by the level of difficulty. Just reading down on like the third or fourth paragraph, second paragraph. It was during the night walks back to the farm that he felt intensely the sweetness of communion. He had been more sensitive than the people about him to the appeal of natural beauty. Here we go. His unfinished studies given him sensibility, and even his unhappiest moments, field and sky spoke to him with a deep and powerful persuasion. But hitherto, the emotion had remained in him as a silent ache, veiling with sadness the beauty that evoked it. Yada yada yada. The sole victim of this mournful privilege. This is like the SAT literature test, and the main focus of the narrative shifts from the ambivalence a character feels about his sensitive nature to the character's recognition of the advantages of having profound emotions. This is challenging, and a lot of lower income kids, lower SES kids, are going to be slammed by this. This is much more challenging reading. Your advanced readers, your kids in AP English will crush this, but a lot of kids aren't at that level of reading and fluency. So they're definitely pushing the levels of this kind of questions. And here, I mentioned to you the level of difficulty, but also this presupposes a certain degree of knowledge about U.S. politics. So this passage was Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, who was, during the impeachment trials of Nixon. Here, today I'm an inquisitor. Hyperbole would not be fictional, would not overstate the solemnness I feel. Again, some pretty advanced language. I'm not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution. Again, this vocabulary is going to stump a lot of kids. Who can so properly be the inquisitors for the nation as the representatives of the nation themselves? The subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, yada, yada, yada. That it comes from the abuse or violation of some public trust. So the impeachment. So this is pretty challenging. And the main rhetorical effect of the series of 3 phrases is to, clarify this, indicate that. This is challenging. So I just want to show you this level of language. We've never seen it before on an SAT. AP, sure. But this is they're really raising the bar and aligning it more with these Common Core standards. So that's to give you a sense of what's happening. Now, all the while, the ACT is shifting, but they're in a much more subtle way. Last year, they announced some changes. Their essay is going to change. Their score reporting will change. It's going digital, a few reading changes, and they're going to have these optional tests, which are long-form student response tests for math, for reading, for writing, as a way to counter the SAT subject test. So they're kind of battling each other on different products. But they're also subtly getting more Common Core aligned, but they do it without all the fanfare and of the College Board. Even think back to '05 when the College Board added writing. Well, guess what? The ACT also added their own optional essay. 1 month before the launch of that for the College Board. So there's definitely a competitive game that's being played here. It has been played for years. Additionally, we started seeing this back in October of 13. The science, the reading passages on the ACT since 1959 have always been single blocks. You have a block of text, and you have 10 questions and 4 vignettes. Very simple, very standard. But in October of 13, we began to see them split passages, having compare and contrast, which we've had on the SAT for decades, and it's also a Common Core standard. The ability to approach something from different perspectives. So that's a change. They didn't announce it. It wasn't in the media, but they're tweaking their test subtly to become more like the SAT. And also, with this new, more advanced SAT essay, well, guess what? The ACT, they're going to change theirs too. And they're going to evaluate analysis, development, and support. It might be longer. And also, they're going to be provided with different perspectives and asked to create their own analysis. So historically, the essay has been, okay, here's a prompt. Should students who have a C average in high school be allowed to get a driving permit? And the students have to write and address both positions, the pro and the con, but it was just 1 point was given. But the new essay, they're going to be given 2 different perspectives and have to analyze it. So again, we're seeing an increase in critical thinking skills, which I think is really good for college kids, because that's what you have to do in college, to give it different perspectives, understand different perspectives. So, but again, this is going to be a harder essay we'll have to teach the kids. Additionally, I anticipate we're going to see harder problems sneaking into the ACT with this new harder content. Currently, it's composed as about a quarter pre-algebra, and then algebra itself, low 30s, geometry 38%, and trig is about 7%. But I anticipate things moving towards more advanced content, possibly more trigonometry, more advanced trigonometry, and beyond, because the ACT is going to, this new harder SAT will put pressure to strengthen the difficulty level of the ACT. Additionally, I mentioned that the long game is lock them in early, and the Aspire is going to be grades 3 through 10, and the College Board came forth and said we are also going to be developing grades 6 through 12 assessments. So that's the long game and the big game, and that's the money game. Money is, if you can get them in all those grades, it's a lot more than just the seniors. Timelines for the testing. So in March, I have to change this. In March, it was announced that there was going to be a problem sets addressed, but now it's pushed to May, and it'll be released on Khan Academy for full tests. We're going to see digital testing coming to the ACT in the spring and the fall. October of next year will be the beginning. It'll be the brand new PSAT, but it'll be intermixed with old SATs. We're going to have October, November, December, and then January, the old SATs, but then we're not going to see the new SAT until March. So that preview PSAT in October will be kind of funky, because some students, I had a parent ask me yesterday, how are you going to, actually a consultant asked me yesterday, how are you going to prep the kids for the new PSAT in October, but also the old SAT in October, November, December, and January? And I said, well, we're going to have a parallel path there for those 2 things. But what's going to happen is the juniors are going to, current sophomores have to figure out, do we go for the old SAT, which we can still take in October, November, December, or January, or do we go for the new SAT after March, or do we go for the ACT? And there are kids who are better at vocabulary, really good at geometry, who might do great on the current SAT. Then there'll be some really smart kids, bright kids, who will do great also on the new SAT. Because one thing also, I mentioned the test will be harder, but it also means there's going to be a harder curve. I'm sorry, a different curve. So like right now, I missed 9 of 18 questions on the calc-free section. So on the current SAT, the curve is very steep. As an example, in November, if you missed 1 math question, you drop down to a 750. That's not going to be the case on the new SAT. And it might be I can miss 8 questions and get a 750 with all that harder content. So kids might be intimidated by the harder content, but they're going to norm it on this large sample of students, and the curve will reflect the level of difficulty of this new test. So even if kids miss some, they can miss some in this new world. So I think the important thing is going to be trying to figure out for your students, are they going to do better on the old SAT, the new SAT, or the ACT, and giving them practice tests to that effect. Gary?
Yes, answer to question number 3 is math. Again, answer to question number 3 is math. Back to you, Jed.
Thank you, sir. All right, so that's the timeline. A few more changes. There's some question, will kids need both? There was an article in the New York Times a couple years ago, back in the more kids are applying with both, but I still believe students should identify their best test and go with it. You don't need to do both tests, and we're seeing kids get into Stanford, Harvard, MIT with one test, whether it's the ACT or the SAT. I don't want kids to waste time or parents to waste money. And in my experience, having a good baseline is the way to go. It's more efficient and more respectful of the kids' insane schedules. Now, the sophomore class, we do not anticipate there's going to be a seamless transition between the old and new SATs, as these are different kinds of tests. So, I think a lot of students are going to say, I'm going to finish all my testing by January, which means if I'm currently a sophomore, I'll have to do some prep over the summer and take, 2 or 3 of the October, November, December, January tests, and then I'll be done with it. Or, certain kids will do the, March, May, or June. The one issue I don't like is the March and May tests on the new SAT. They're going to delay the score give back for 6 weeks or more, which means you're going to take the March test and not get a score back till after May, until after the May test. So you might not know what you have to study, how you did. We rely on that feedback in the world of test prep, and so having flying blind for a couple months, I dislike it. So that concerns me some. But still, some kids will do, especially the more advanced students, will do very well on the new SAT, and so just expect that. So if your kids want to go with a new one, they can prep starting late fall or winter. If you choose the ACT, then the timelines are as they've always been. Kids can prep in the summer or in the fall, and I wanted them to knock out 2 or 3 ACTs by June. Some kids might do February, April, June. Some kids might do December, February, April, whatever, or some kids might do it in 2 tests, but they're not going to be in a rush. But if they're taking the old SAT, they have to be done by January. That's an important point for your kids and parents to hear. National merit. What's interesting is often we look at the PSAT scores from sophomore year to predict who will get national merit when they're juniors, but the thing of it is they're different tests. We have the October of this year, PSAT was on the old form, but next October it's a new test. So kids who might have been phenomenal at geometry or phenomenal vocabulary might not do as well. But kids who did well, I want to prep them for the new content and really get them sharpened up over the summer, fall, because national merit, as you all know, can be a direct pathway to money, merit money for your kids. That can, free tuition, in-state tuition. Some of the scheduling, typically we like testing to live in junior year, but in this, actually we've heard of some IECs advising their kids to go ahead and even consider taking the May or June old SAT if they're sophomores, which is, we normally discourage that, but in this year of transition, I'm not averse to it, let's say, if people want to try that. I don't encourage it, but I'm not going to go ahead and say that's a bad idea. Now, I'm going to skim through this. The digital tests that are coming are going to be transformational. They're going to fundamentally change our conception of assessment, of testing. Once we get to dynamic, interactive interfaces, virtual labs, it's videos, it's going to really shift, our multiple choice world we live in is going away to a much deeper, richer kind of assessment, which we'll be seeing over the next 5-6 years. We're already seeing changes in the GMAT and GRE with adaptive stuff, and PARCC is cutting edge. PARCC's been leading the way, showing off their new assessment types, which is why they don't like doing paper-based testing. They want to have deeper, richer assessments. And they're doing things where the student can move the dots, things where the students fill in equations. It goes way beyond multiple choice. Here, you can start building an equation. Here there are videos where you watch a video and then build the equation to see what happened. This is way beyond multiple choice, and honestly really does show, do you know this content? Not are you test-wise, but are you math-wise? And these are going to fundamentally change how we view assessment. One of the big changes that's happening, Common Core deficits now are going to be a bigger deal, and kids who are showing Common Core short weaknesses in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, they might not wait till they're a junior on the SAT to fix those and remediate those. We might see prep for they missed a key component of writing or reading in 9th grade, so some prep might move them. This thing might spread out over time, more organic, not just a a 6-week thing you do when you're a junior. You might do 2 weeks when you're a junior, but 2 weeks when you're a sophomore, 2 weeks when you're a freshman, addressing Common Core issues and shortcomings. And that's the end. That's what we do. So we have 5 minutes. And I know, Gary, you have your 4th question to get out there.
Yeah, and we've got some questions for you too. Answer to the 4th question is digital assessment. Again, that answer to number 4 is digital assessment. Let's jump right into it. First question is, what is PARCC?
PARC is a group, a statewide consortia. PARC and Smarter Balanced. It's like a partnership for advanced assessment of readiness for college. It's an acronym, and what it is the Department of Education. They funded 2 groups, Smarter Balanced and PARC, who initially had like 47 members. Now they're down to the mid-30s, but they are developing assessments to measure Common Core mastery. So, like Chicago, Illinois, like they're allocating money for PARC tests. Like Georgia may have pulled out of PARC or Smarter Balanced, but they're going to make their own tests. But across the country, these are the testing groups that were designed and funded by the government to make Common Core tests for the future.
Okay. Next question. How are colleges viewing the new Common Core testing? Will they ever replace the SAT and or ACTs?
That remains to be seen. These things are in their very first year. They're being rolled out. Will colleges pay attention to these? I would not be surprised if they wouldn't, if they were curious, because these, that's part of the battle, because the College Board and the ACT, they're looking at this saying, wait a minute, we have to Common Core line. Because my sense is colleges are going to want to see the mastery of these core principles, which we've all decided and agreed upon. These are what you need to do well in college and workforce. So I would not be surprised, but right now we're in a wait-and-see mode.
And now on the other side of the table, what's your opinion for the new SATs and private school students that do not follow the Common Core?
This is going to be an issue because these private schools who like their really nice matriculation lists and kids getting great scores, they're going to have to either adjust their curriculum or just know that these kids will be going outside for prep. Because this is the new skill set that these tests will assess, and I'm assuming that the ACT is going to make a move in this direction. Also, right now, if the ACT stays as it is, then these private schools will be fine. Because right now, the College Board got way in front of the Common Core, and they transformed their test, whereas the ACT hasn't done that yet. So if there are 2 parallel paths, this just might push more and more kids and more private school towards the ACT.
Okay. Another attendee, they read your article yesterday about how colleges will view the new/old SATs for the current 10th graders. Any insight on why Carnegie Mellon won't take the old SATs into consideration for 10th graders?
Carnegie Mellon may be the only one of the 2,500. We called a bunch of colleges. Some of them, they're trying to figure it out. And I'll check with Carnegie Mellon. I heard the same thing about Penn State, and we verified it, and we called them. And they said actually no. But there's some rumblings that one Ivy might flip. And the reason is apparently this new SAT, it's a better assessment. And I feel like it will play out over time that this thing is a better measure of if you score well on the new SAT, it'll help colleges really pick kids who are really ready for college. So I think that's the move they're making, but the lion's share of schools out there are going to let sophomores do both in this year of transition. The same thing when the GMAT switched and the GRE switched. Most universities said we'll take both for this year, but for current freshmen, they are locked into the new SAT. So, but Carnegie Mellon will be in, I think, a very small minority if it, and I still want to call them and confirm it, because to me, I've heard rumors which have been untrue so far.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question: if a student is in honors only or AP courses which don't focus on the CCSS instruction, how are you going to fare on the SATs?
Well, I mean, again, if it's not being assessed, if teachers aren't teaching it in this style, these students are going to have to learn it somewhere on their own, in preparation, or the College Board's offering things through Khan Academy. But if this is how they're going to be assessing math knowledge, either you learn this language or you will be at an extreme disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question relating to weather, okay? If the test gets snowed out like it did this past January, would they be obligated to offer the old SAT for a makeup date instead of forcing the people to take the new SAT test?
I would be inclined to say yes, because I think we're going to see a groundswell of people trying to get in before that door closes.
Mm-hmm.
And January will be the biggest test of next year, without question. And I think March will probably be the smallest, as people wait and see. But my sense is, because it's going to be a crush, I don't know how many, I think they would go ahead and offer a makeup, even though that would be challenging for them in terms of logistics in certain states.
And this has to do with the time of the test and length. As we know, the test is getting longer, but this person asks, has anyone addressed the time of the day the test is given? High school students sometimes don't wake up till 10 a.m. And in his area, the test starts at 8 a.m.
And let me just correct that. The test is actually not getting any longer.
Okay.
The administration time will be identical, but with including the optional essay. And in fact, if you exclude the essay, it's getting shorter, because the current test is 3 hours and 45 minutes, and which includes the Section 1 essay. The new assessment is going to be 3 hours of material and then the, quote, optional 45-minute essay. So it's actually net the same, but if kids aren't doing the essay, they're going to get out an hour earlier. So they'll be finished by noon. Now, in terms of addressing the timing, there's all this research that kids are not at their sharpest at 8 in the morning. And that's actually, I just came from a Learning in the Brain conference in California. One of the reasons why kids often, they quote, blossom in college, but it's simply because they're able to get enough sleep and not have to get up at 8 in the morning or 7 in the morning. Because often kids do so much better at 10 o'clock, 10:30. Just their brains they're more functioning. So I think it would be amazing, and I would do better personally if they offered a 10 o'clock assessment or a 1 to 5 assessment. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing in the works I've heard so far to that effect.
Other question I have, is there still an experimental section on the new SAT? And you might have covered that. I'm sorry, but the question.
I didn't. They are abandoning, as a way to get that timeline down to make room for the longer essay, they are cutting the experimental section. So that'll never be there anymore. The same as the ACT does all their research externally, they're going to have to do the same thing for the College Board, because they've been norming their questions and their items using the experimental section, but now they're going to have to do it just by having kids show up and take practice tests at the College Board sites.
Okay. And I have a couple questions here on the same topic here, and it comes down to, how do students identify what's going to be the best test for them?
The single best way for students to identify what's going to be the best test for them is to take a practice test. And that's something that at Appleroot we administer them. We can give them to your kids online. We have a virtual proctor. We use official calibrated tests, and under no circumstances use a practice test that hasn't been calibrated. There's a really shadowy thing in our industry where students are given really, really hard baseline tests, thereby deflating their intro scores and thereby manufacturing a score increase, which to me is unethical. But a lot of groups do it. So make sure anyone doing an assessment is using an official College Board ACT calibrated test. Otherwise, you might be kind of cheated or scammed. Mm-hmm. And so again, but those practice tests are available. They're public. They're released. We're going to have 4 new ones for the new SAT being released via Khan in May, and there'll probably be a book coming out from the College Board soon thereafter, like the 8 new SATs.
Another question here. We'll only take a couple more because we're running a little over here, and I want to keep this as close to an hour as possible. It seems unavoidable that colleges will begin to see the new SAT as a true measure of the top students. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. They've increased the level of difficulty of textual complexity. They've increased the math difficulty level. And students who do well on this test, they're going to be ready to rock and roll in college. And that may be the long game here, which might pressure the ACT to change, because they've made a more rigorous assessment, but I think it'll be a better predictor. So I agree with that.
Okay. Now, referencing digital tests, with these new digital tests, could that possibly hurt students who don't have access to practice with these digital exams?
The digital divide is real. There is a socioeconomic gap in terms of the haves and have-nots in that regard. The federal government will be filling in, trying to increase funding to get lower-income schools up to speed in terms of their computer labs and carousels and tablets and so forth. But students who have great experience with technology from their childhood on, I think will have an advantage.
Yeah.
So the answer is, for a time, the answer is yes. That'll be an issue.
Okay. And we're just going to do two more real quick here. What do you think of test-optional colleges? What will they do?
Test-optional colleges, many of them will continue to do what they're doing. Many of them have found a diversity bump by going test-optional and an admissions bump, where they get more kids to apply, which helps their numbers, and they get more diverse applicants. So my sense is that trend will continue, especially as the students who tend to do very well on tests become a smaller portion of our U.S. population, and they want to keep their beds full. But I still think the most selective schools, who are flooded with applications, still need some way to reduce the applicant load, and testing is a very efficient means. It also helps them against grade inflation. It helps them counter that when you have all these kids with 3.4s but who are really not ready for college. The assessments can help you give one more measure.
Yeah. And one last thing, could you give us your contact information in case there's any questions that come up later on?
Absolutely. So our website is www.appleroot.com. My email is jed@appleroot.com. And if you want to give me a call, our main office line is 404-728-0661. That's our Atlanta number, and our 800 number is 866-789-7737. Yep.
And two more questions, and I'm going to let you go after, I promise.
Sure, okay.
How do you think new SATs will impact minority enrollment?
I feel like the new SATs are going to be a bit of a shock to some of the minority low SES students out there, because looking at, I just showed you some of those problems, some of the textual, the language, wowzers. Yeah. It might intimidate, and that's the issue. It might discourage kids, and we have to coach them that this is a harder test but a different curve, but that message might be lost. And students might see this and all of a sudden feel completely out of their element and overwhelmed. And that's a concern. And so I think the College Board will have to really convey this message. But yeah, I can see a classroom full of kids who are looking at this saying, oh my God. I can imagine that classroom. At some private schools, but definitely some low SES, high, minority, high immigrant classes being overwhelmed by this new material.
And the last question, if colleges already show preference for the new SAT versus the old SAT, might we also see a return to colleges preferring the new SATs instead of accepting the ACTs?
That is, I believe, part of the College Board's long game, that if they make a better test playing to what colleges want, that it might force, they might gain share, or I just think the ACT will adapt. But we're not going to know definitively until we have data, which is a few years out. But in the meantime, I just see a tremendous migration towards the ACT. So this might be a brilliant move by David Coleman, who's one of the Common Core test writers, or they might shed 500,000 students. We saw that graph, and things are really moving. And as the ACT is gaining currency, getting more state contracts, this might be the beginning of the complete ascendance of the ACT. So we'll see how it plays out.
Well, Jed, I personally like to thank you for doing this webinar. You've been doing this now on an annual basis for the past 5 years for us, and it's
Yeah.
always been a tremendous webinar, and we really appreciate it. And I'm looking already forward to next year and inviting you back again. So thank you for your time today.
My pleasure, Gary.
To everyone else who joined us, thank you for taking time out of your busy day. I know it's crazy out there right now. You've got to get back to work. Just remember that our next webinar is on March 10th, and Joe Nagy is going to be with us. And for those that know Joe, he loves trusts, and he's going to be doing a whole session on trusts and college financial aid.